Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the second keynote speech today. Our second keynote speaker is Mr. Pablo Hinojosa. Mr. Hinojosa is the Strategic Engagement Director at APNIC. He represents APNIC in the public sector primarily by fostering and managing relationships with governments, key intergovernmental and treaty organizations, as well as related bodies. Today, Mr. Hinojosa will explore 4 trends in Internet governance in the past 2 decades. In particular, how democratic has Internet governance been, how national interests have been protected, how multi-stakeholder decisions have been made, and how security has been considered. His speech will highlight the importance of active participation by different stakeholders in shaping the future of Internet governance. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our second keynote speaker, Mr. Pablo Hinojosa.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope so. My name is Pablo. It is a real honor to be here with you today. As Paul Wilson, my boss, said this morning at the welcoming ceremony, this engagement forum is an important event that shows the commitment not only from TWNIC, but also from the Taiwanese Internet community as a whole to the wider Internet ecosystem. I will be talking today about Internet governance, its trends and opportunities. This is something that I wrote as an introduction. In the last 20 years or so, there have been many changes in the Internet governance landscape. Many principles, norms, and decision-making procedures have been developed and applied, effectively shaping the evolution and use of the Internet. But for many years, Internet governance focused mostly on Internet numbers and domain names. But today, it is referring to something far more extensive than that. Today, in my presentation, I will explore 4 trends in Internet governance during the last 20 years. I will talk about how democratic has Internet governance been, how national interests have been protected, how multi-stakeholder decisions have been made, and how security has been considered. Now, it is important to say that my suggested answers to these questions are not necessarily true. I am not a professor that have been doing research, and I'm going to demonstrate my answers through measurements and data. The answers that I present here are just a point of view. You can say opinions about how in APNIC we interpret the Internet governance story of the last 20 years. So these points of view are subject to discussion, and that's actually the reason why I'm bringing this to you. And I encourage you to challenge my perspective, so I hope to leave time for questions at the end. Also, it's important to say that the history of Internet governance is still fresh and young, and many of these issues have not settled completely. So we in APNIC are interested to discuss this with you, whether these interpretations that I'm going to give make sense or not. And based on this interpretation, the fact is that we take decisions and we encourage community to take decisions to engage actively in Internet governance matters.
Excuse
me? So
that's
how I'm going to, yes?
Excuse me, Mr. Hinojosa, do you mind sharing your PowerPoint slides with us on the screen?
I think I have, right? You are not seeing them?
We are not seeing your PowerPoint slides at the moment.
Oh, I think you should. I have shared my screen.
Do you mind sharing it again? It's at the bottom of the screen.
Yes.
Yes, you are sharing it. Yes, now we see your slides. Please continue. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Sorry about that. I didn't notice that you didn't get them. So these are the 4 trends that I'm going to explore. These are the 4 questions that I'm going to give. These are interpretations. How democratic has Internet governance been? How national interests have been protected? How multi-stakeholder decisions have been made? And how security has been considered? Okay, let's get into each of the sections. Each one has its own color. democratic is blue, and how democratic internet governance have been. And it's interesting because what do you mean by democratic? What do you mean by national interest, et cetera, et cetera? So in each of these sections, I will provide an interpretation, and then I will show some videos of key people whose perspectives have shaped these trends. Actually, let me stop sharing and share again, because I need to be sure that the sound is on. So can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so what do we mean by democratic? Well, it is clear that internet has grown enormously in the last 20 years, connecting more than half of the world's population. This has resulted in increased participation of many new players in internet governance processes and decisions as well. 20 years ago, there were only a handful of countries that were active in the internet governance scene. But today, it is clear that both the developed and the developing world see the internet and connectivity as most important and strategic. I see this increased participation as the reason why internet governance has become more democratic over the years. As I said in the beginning, initially, internet governance was mostly about internet numbers and domain names. And this is also why I see the IANA transition completed in 2016 as a democratic milestone for internet governance. As you know, the IANA functions are critical to the internet and were controlled for many years by the government of the United States, the Department of Commerce. And in 2016, the exceptional role of one single government, the United States government, was transferred or democratized to a wider internet community of diverse stakeholders who basically are now in charge of overseeing the IANA functions. Here I will present the video from Ambassador David Gross. At the time, in 2005, he was the head of delegation of the United States, and he was defending the interests of the United States government in front of United Nations World Summit on the Information Society. So this is a video taken before he left Washington to go to Tunis to defend the interests of the United States government. Let's hear what he said.
We are in the middle of the negotiations now about internet governance and a whole host of other issues to prepare the documents for the summit in November. We have a number of jobs to do as we negotiate the text of these documents. First and foremost is not to lose that which we already have. We believe, of course, with tremendous passion and zeal, that the genius of the internet was its less regulated nature. That government should stay out, but for those few very, very narrow situations where it's needed. And so how we can engage in a dialogue that gives them comfort about our intentions and the role of the U.S. government, while at the same time not endangering one iota of the sorts of things that we care about and are important, not just for the United States, but because we think they're important for everyone.
So as you can see, the U.S. position was very strong, and they were opposed at the time when many developing countries were starting to get into the internet era. And they were opposed at the time to democratize the IANA functions, which were the key focus of internet governance back in those days. Let me go now to message that Vince Cerf provided in one of the ICANN meetings about the process that led towards the IANA transition.
The project began with support from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in 1973, and in fact, preceding that was the ARPANET project starting in 1968. But as time went on, responsibility for this system devolved from DARPA to the Defense Communications Agency, which is now called DISA, and then to the National Science Foundation, and then ultimately to the Department of Commerce. And in those transitions, the United States government reduced its position, its authority, its decision-making activity with regard to internet. This was a continuous, essentially relegation or delegation of responsibility away from the government.
A continuous relegation or delegation of responsibility away from the government. So as years passed, the internet governance landscape became more inclusive and democratic, particularly as the IANA functions moved away from the oversight of one single government. So this is what I propose as the democratic trend in internet governance. I mean, as you can see, the UN summit back in 2005, which was the second phase of it, the end of it, triggered sort of more participation and more inclusion of more countries, of more stakeholders into the internet governance world. And it reached a milestone in the IANA transition, as I've said. But I would like to suggest that in the last few years, only powerful players, being governments or big tech companies, as Milton said in his presentation before, they are the ones making decisions, mostly in closed rooms with little participation from stakeholders and relevant communities. So I see in the last years the democratic trend has diminished somehow. Let's go to the protection of national interests throughout the history of internet governance. What I suggest here is that there is obviously a trend about how this global infrastructure that is the internet has challenged key principles of international law and international relations, namely that each state has sovereignty over its own territory and domestic affairs, to the exclusion of all external powers. So the internet clearly challenged this model, known as the Westphalian model, and there are more laws and regulations at the local level, and it is the more national laws and regulation, the more difficulty it is to standardize them internationally. There is no such thing as a global treaty to understand how internet governance works, or a global organization that is in charge of all of these. So it is difficult to protect national interests on the internet because it is such a complex system, and imposing cross-border jurisdictional issues is indeed complicated. For example, with data localization. So, of course, this has triggered a perception of cyber instability. It's a perception because, as we know, the internet has remained very stable, particularly resilient during this pandemic time that all of us rely on this infrastructure very much. But there is this perception of cyber instability that has triggered many countries to want to exercise some sort of cyber sovereignty. Let's listen to Chancellor Angela Merkel. She was talking in 2019 at the Internet Governance Forum in Berlin.
Some in this world find that such an open internet, a free internet, and the decentralized structure of the internet is an irritant in the eyes of some non-democratic states, and their leadership interfere in the freedoms that the internet creates. They are trying to push through their own or national interests, and to this end they are trying to shut off their national networks from the global internet. And some private companies too invest in their own isolated infrastructure, which then entails the danger that global companies build up parallel universes with their own standards, their own rules, that then they impose through international bodies on others. That's a very, very tricky issue. We have to understand that we need to act multilaterally, and this will be the only way how we can actually come to a common understanding what we mean when we talk of an open internet.
So this trend towards protecting national interests is also reflected at the international level, and how the defense of national interests and the international setting has created more and more tensions between countries on internet governance matters. I want to show another perspective that reflects on this trend about protecting national interests. This is from the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, also speaking at
the IGN. Internet emerging: Californian cyberspace and Chinese cyberspace. In other words, one model where we have globally dominant private sector actors, which of course have a lot going for them, many qualities, but these people were not democratically elected. And I personally would not give up all decisions concerning my life up to these actors. That's the self-management, self-regulation model, which is not democratic. On the other hand, we have a strong state model, the Chinese model. The government is in control. Major AI players are government-controlled. So in that model, the state is present, and in fact, it's the hegemon. But what we need is a new way forward, whereby states work hand in hand with civil society actors and the private sector to introduce regulation.
So here is where he speaks about the stronger enforcement of regulation at the national and the international level. So this is our interpretation of national interest trend that has, in our opinion, no question that the trend is towards an increased protection of national interests in the last 20 years. There was some moment, for example, in the 90s, where some, like John Perry Barlow, in his famous Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, he promoted a notion of cyberspace as a separate from government or national control. And clearly, states have been very active in controlling and regulating this global infrastructure and imposing virtual walls to protect their national interests. Another example of this trend is how local regulations, for example, the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, have an effect in how national interests are protected and enforced internationally. Of course, the more nationalistic internet governance becomes, the more tensions and conflict we can expect around internet matters as well. Okay, this takes me to the third trend I'm going to talk about, which is multi-stakeholder decisions around internet governance. So one feature of the multi-stakeholder model is that the more actors are involved, the better the decision outcomes occur or are made. Particularly, this works if it is possible to find paths towards agreements. And this only works as well when everyone has a collaborative spirit. The multi-stakeholder model has worked very well in the governance of internet names and numbers, as you all know, clearly showing how bottom-up and community-driven processes can result in good policies and community-driven decisions. But it is also true that this multi-stakeholder model of the governance of the internet has been difficult to export or replicate in other areas different from internet addresses. I refer again to the IANA transition because it was a milestone where trust was placed into the multi-stakeholder model instead of a government-centered model. Whether this model can endure or will endure and expand in something is yet to be seen, and much work needs to be done to demonstrate the capabilities of a multi-stakeholder model. Let me show a video of Ira Magaziner. He is one of the designers of the multi-stakeholder institutional model that gave birth to organizations such as ICANN and its unique decision-making model.
Okay, so the internet was still very small. But we felt that there needed to be some market-driven, quickly moving vehicle that could embody the marketplace and the multi-stakeholders in the internet, but be recognized by governments so that legally they could withstand legal challenges to what they were doing. And after a comment process and so on, a year and a half, ICANN was born from that process. And it was a first of its kind organization in the world, where you had a private nonprofit organization recognized by governments, with governments playing an advisory role. Now, we did that because we felt that even though we were supporters of the United Nations overall, that the internet needed to be market-driven, it needed to be bottoms-up, it needed to be democratic, and it needed to move quickly.
So, speaking about the trend, I reflect that there was an increasing period of time in which multi-stakeholder model became more relevant. This, again, started from the UN World Summit on Information Society and peaked at the IANA transition. However, it seems that in the last years, multi-stakeholderism is not expanding. Actually, I suggest it is contracting. Many discussions in the international and intergovernmental arena have closed doors to multi-stakeholder participation and have restricted decision-making only to governments, or, as Milton reflected, to big tech companies that they don't have community-driven decision-making in setting up their policies. Let's look at the last trend that I'm going to explore, which is about security. And I think it is not controversial to say that worries about cybersecurity has increased in the last 20 years. Fact is that the more that we are concerned about security, the less trust we have on the internet as a global system. And many of the national responses to incidents, being these incidents state-driven or not, I mean, they tend to increase tensions and conflict, which we can see a lot these days. And also Milton showed us a lot of examples of how those tensions are amplifying rather than diminishing. And obviously, decisions about security may have unintended consequences, such as those attempts by governments to implement policies for content takedown or filtering that have led to accidental BGP hijacking, even disconnecting a huge portion of population to access content that was not that was relevant and important. Let me show you the Secretary General of the United Nations in one of his remarks, who speaks about sort of this trend.
Today, not only we are still building physical walls to separate people, but that there is also the tendency to create some virtual walls in the internet also to separate people. The growing frequency and severity of cyber attacks are undermining trust and encouraging states to adopt offensive postures for the hostile use of cyberspace.
This takes me to this reflection that throughout the years, security incidents have become more sophisticated with more damaging consequences and increasing perception of risks and concerns, mostly, as I've said, at the national level. So the suggestion here is an exponential trend where security concerns have increased dramatically in the last few years. Here are some examples of these incidents. So these four trends are leading me towards sort of my concluding remarks. If we try to see them all together, we can see sort of a trend in democratization, a trend in protecting national interests, a trend in multi-stakeholderism and securitization of the internet governance history. And I place here this line, which is actually the milestone of the IANA transition, to provide a reflection of what is coming next after the IANA transition in these 4 categories. And this brings me back to the original idea of this engagement forum in this open policy meeting that actually encourages the Taiwanese internet community to be active and engaged in a wider ecosystem. And what I'm trying to say is that this community's views and interpretation of how the history is should provide or prescribe the positions that we need to take. And I see opportunities to reverse some of the trends that are happening during the last few years in order for these trends to be more democratic, less nationally focused, more multi-stakeholder, and less concerned with security, in order for us to arrive to something that I think we shared in common, which is a mission about an open, stable, and secure internet. And I think I will want to leave you with these reflections, and I still have 6 or so minutes open for questions. So I just want to thank everyone to listen to these trends and opportunities and interpretation of the history of internet governance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hinojosa, for sharing your insights with us. We still have a couple of minutes left, so we would like to open the floor for maybe 1 question. So if you have any questions, please come forward and use these 2 microphone stands that we have here. So is there any questions from the floor? Do we have any questions? Yes, please. Please use the microphone stands, and please briefly identify your name and also the affiliation before you ask your questions. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for your very interesting and informative talk. My name is Patrick Boland. I'm from AIT, which is the American Institute in Taiwan here. I just had a question, looking at the trends of democratization and multi-stakeholder going down at the same time as securitization and national interest going up. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about your view from AP-NIC about the role of governments in that, and if you see a trend, whether it's through the balkanization of the internet itself, growing firewalls, or if it's actual government policy that's been responsible for that, or do you think the private sector plays a bigger role there? Thank you for your comments.
Stakeholder model, and we truly believe that decisions are better made when the interested parties, and particularly for us, when the technical community is considered. Because we see a lot that governments may want to protect certain interests, but not necessarily consider unintended consequences that may affect the technical operation of the network. So it is something that we always try to bring, a collaborative notion of cybersecurity, a collaborative notion between operators and policymakers, and that dialogue that we think is always very important for any internet governance consideration.
Is there just as a quick follow-up, is there more that certain governments can do or to engage this, or do you have any comment about how other governments try to stifle the multi-stakeholder nature of the internet?
Well, there is certainly room for much more for governments to do, but also very importantly for technical community to also do and engage proactively and be very active in shaping the internet governance that we want. And that's why the proposal here is to forums such like these engage actively in these discussions and engage actively in other discussions for these trends to be more democratic and more multi-stakeholder, and reduce that perception of instability or those tensions that arise from cybersecurity matters.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hinojosa. We still have one more question from the floor, and due to time constraints, that will be our last question for this session, please.
Pablo, nice to see you here.
Hello. Yeah. I wish I would be there.
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to add a comment regarding for the previous questions. Okay, this is the Galway retirement person. Okay. And TWIGF, okay. And actually, my comment is, government always have a role in the national security or whatever. But the government have to be very careful, because the government usually, they are not technical capable enough to deep into this kind of security issues. Sometimes they will overdo it. When they are overdue, it's really a tragedy. So, like Pablo say, the multi-stakeholder, I think basically in Taiwan, the multi-stakeholder, the mechanism how to in the operation in Taiwan, we still have a long way to learn. I think if you are in Taiwan enough to watching about the public hearing of the legislature, well, that is not like a U.S. public hearing. And they even not in so-called multi-stakeholder mechanism yet. Because the multi-stakeholder mechanism, we should come out a different view from the different actor, and just like Pablo say, when you are talking about the security, we need more technical community to participate, to tell you how to justify enough and not overdo. When that is overdue, that would be really bad. And we see that happen before several times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wu, for your comments. And thank you, Mr. Hinojosa, for answering all these questions. Due to time constraints, we're going to close this session here. Let us thank our keynote speaker, Mr. Hinojosa, once again, for his very insightful presentation. Thank you, Mr. Hinojosa, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.